So I want to give you guys a backstory before we get into this. A while back, I had a Twitter account that was giant. It had a lot of followers. At least for the time, it was big. It should have been verified. There were other left-wing accounts that were verified with only a few thousand followers. I had about 40,000 followers. But my account, instead of being verified, was deleted because I put out a tweet that said Islam and Sharia law are one and the same. It's like Christianity and the Ten Commandments. There are no separating the two. Now, this is completely factual. There's no debating this. But the left don't want to debate us, especially on the cultural issues. They can't win those debates. So instead, they call us racist and they block us. They try to delete our accounts, etc., etc. Anyway, fast forward to a few days ago. I was in the comments section on the Joe Rogan podcast video where he's talking with the Twitter executives and Tim Pool about deleting right-wing Twitter accounts. And I said, yeah, they're giving people like Sargon of Akkad warnings before they delete their account, but they're deleting thousands of smaller accounts without warning. And in another comment, I said, they don't want to debate us on these cultural issues. Anyway, these comments I posted got a lot of responses. And one of the responses was from a left-winger who wanted to debate me. So I was thrilled about this. He invites me to the Destiny Discord server. So I knew going in that this Destiny GG Discord server would be enemy territory. Destiny is like the social justice PewDiePie. He's got the blue hair, he does video game videos, and his following are going to be younger, left-leaning individuals. And my experience with these people, at least in the real world on college campuses and at some of these Trump events, is that they do not want to engage us in debate. Instead, they try to shut us down by screaming over us or straw-manning us, or in some cases, when they actually do try to debate, they either pile on or try to derail us. And all of that happened, and ultimately I did get booted from the server, but it took about 12 hours because I was quite careful on how I approached this. And what I learned in those 12 hours, it gave me a very good idea of some of the things we can do to counter these tactics. And that's what today's video is all about. Left-wing debate tactics and how we can counter them. So I'll go in the order in which I observed these techniques. And the first tactic I observed came from the guy who invited me into the chat. And it's a tactic we see all too often. It is trying to discredit your opponent. Now, as soon as I got into this chat, the guy who invited me in started calling me stupid, started cursing at me, calling me a Nazi, calling me a racist, doing everything he could to avoid any kind of meaningful dialogue. And the way we counter this is not by apologizing, okay? When we resort to apologetics, which is something that's done all too often by people on the right, when we say, hey, I'm not a Nazi, I'm not a racist, we're playing right into their hand. Instead, what you want to do is steer the conversation back to the topic at hand. And if they don't want to go there, like the guy I was trying to debate, ask him why he's avoiding any kind of meaningful debate. Why don't you want to talk about the issue we came to talk about? That is how we counter this approach. If trying to discredit your opponent by calling them racist and sexist and a Nazi is the most common tactic we see from the left, the second tactic is probably the second most common, and that is trying to straw man your opponent. Now, Webster's defines a straw man as an intentional misrepresentation of an argument that is set up because it is easier to defeat than your opponent's actual argument. So this tactic was used against me by every single person I debated several times throughout the night. And one great example of this was when we were debating universal health care. Now, I argued that through certain market reforms, such as allowing people to negotiate drug prices, allowing younger people to buy only catastrophic care insurance, and actually having HHS waivers for those people who have pre-existing conditions, we could have a much more affordable system than the actual tax burden of universal health care on a federal level. And because I said that, I was accused of being pro-corporation, pro-monopoly, and pro-death. Now, the way you counter this is you say, okay, tell me how I'm wrong. Tell me what's wrong about this policy. Tell me exactly what part makes me pro-death or pro-corporation. There are several ways the left use this third tactic, which is to change the rules of the debate when it suits them. Now I'm going to give you guys two examples of how they did this, and these were actually used in conjunction with one another. And these might sound very familiar to you guys because I see them use this technique all of the time. Now the first was when they asked me to provide a source for a generalized statement. Now that statement was that communism always fails. This is a universal truth. Everybody knows this. But they asked me for a source proving this. Now they didn't do it because they don't know that communism always fails. They did it to try to slow down the debate and try to put me on the defensive. So what I did was I showed them different surveys that show quality of life, economic health, economic freedom, and I showed how they were all related to countries that had more free markets. So that's when they used their second approach, which was to say that I couldn't use these arguments because correlation does not show causation. Now, this is funny because when you talk about these things like free markets versus a planned economy, every planned economy throughout history has failed. So you could say, look, you have all of these examples of why they failed, but they want something to show causation. So then you have to break it down to every single decision ever made by all of these different governments. So you would think that it would be easy to counter this by holding them accountable to their own rules. And sometimes that works. Unfortunately, more often than not, when you're debating a leftist, they will use tactic number 5, which is to avoid making any normative or positive statements. So by avoiding making any statements that affirm their beliefs or show where they stand on a position, they put all of that responsibility onto you, and therefore you are the one who's always on the defensive. So the way you counter this in the example I gave you is if you say, okay, here's the information that links capitalism to success and communism to failure, and then they try to say that that doesn't prove anything. You then ask them, well, what do you think causes these countries to succeed or fail? You make them define a position, and then they are on the defensive. So the final tactic that I want to talk about is one that is used far too often by both sides and is causing a lot of problems for society right now. And of course, I'm talking about using false statistics or statistics taken out of context to build a false narrative. Now, right now, with academia and the mainstream media being dominated by the left, we are seeing them use these false narratives, weaponize them, and it is causing serious issues. For instance, when they say that more unarmed black men are being shot by police, and that's because police are institutionally racist, that causes problems. And the truth is that maybe more unarmed black men are being shot by police when you talk about the per capita numbers, but they never talk about the number of white men shot by police that actually far outnumbers black men. They never talk about the circumstances that lead to these shootings, and they never talk about the crime rate in the black community. So I'll give you two examples of how these false statistics were used against me when I was debating these leftists. One was when we were talking about Cuba, and they were saying that Cuba has the best free healthcare system in the world. Now, this is completely untrue. Anybody with eyes can go to Cuba and see the hospitals in Cuba, and they are absolutely hell on earth. But what happens is some academics go to Cuba and they start studying some of these statistics, and they look at infant mortality. They look at overall access to healthcare, and they look at affordability. Well, of course, it's going to be affordable. It's free. When you get free, crappy healthcare, it's still crappy. It's just free. But the other statistic that was taken out of context in these studies was the infant mortality rate, because Cuba actually forces abortions on women who have abnormal fetal ultrasounds. So when you abort all of these babies who might have Down syndrome or other genetic defects, that causes the statistics to go up. So that's the way that they use statistics out of context to try to win an argument. And the way you counter that is you actually have to look at the source they post and then find the information that they conveniently leave out. In this case, it was the fact that Cubans are aborting their fetuses when they find out that the fetus has a genetic defect on the x-ray. And this is forced abortion, which goes back to something else I was debating them on, which is that socialism and communism always end in authoritarianism because you have to force compliance. Now, the other end of this tactic is the false narrative, using false narratives to try to win an argument. And this is much more dangerous because this includes what I talked about earlier, the idea that blacks are being attacked by police unfairly. And it also includes something that we were debating, which is the trans suicide rate. Now, the narrative that they used was that the trans community has a higher suicide rate because us evil right-wingers are oppressing them and not letting them use the bathroom they want to use. And that's completely false. This has been put out by the media and by all of these left-wing academics, and it is not true at all. Okay, when you talk about people who are trans, they have a body identity disorder. Now, this is a psychological disorder that makes them unhappy and uncomfortable in their body. I have often talked about how I have PTSD, and I don't want somebody telling me that I'm normal. I would want one of my friends to say, hey, you need to get counseling for your PTSD. I don't want them to throw me a parade. So it's not us on the right causing their suicide rate to be so high. It is the fact that instead of getting treatment, instead of going to counseling, they are taking actions like having a sex change operation, and then after the operation, they are still having regrets. They still don't feel comfortable in their body. And so when he brought that up, I mentioned the fact that they have such a high post-surgical regret rate. I mentioned the fact that the studies that show why they are suicidal often show that it's due to unhappiness with who they are or perception of their body. And then he got triggered. So you can see how this is dangerous to run with these false narratives. So I know this video is different from a lot of videos I do. I wanted to do this for a couple of reasons. First, I want to prepare you guys for that rare opportunity where you might debate a left-winger. I wanted you guys to know some of these trappings they might use. But I also did this video to rub it in the face of that little punk who's still commenting on Joe Rogan's video and remind him that he ran away from the debate as soon as he started to lose. He was making silly emotional arguments. He was ignoring meaningful statistics. And no matter how many emotional arguments you make for it, if you can't afford universal health care, if you do a cost-benefit analysis and you're giving up far too much to have one little program to help a few people, it's not worth it. You know, I'd rather keep $1,000 extra a month in tax money and spend it how I need it than buy health care because the government forces me to. All right? I think I can better use my own money than the government can. I would rather not bring in all of the third world's problems just because some people are having problems with crime in a Central American country. Okay, yeah, it's bad, but it's no worse than places like Chicago. And crying over a few people way out there when you have people here in America who need help. You have problems here in America that can be addressed. It makes no sense at all. We are not the white knights and the saviors of the world. And the fact that you think you are just shows that you have a white savior complex and you are everything you accuse us of being. So anyway, guys, like and subscribe to the channel, share the video. I'll end by showing you guys some new pieces from my collection. Don't forget you can donate to the channel at paypal.me/HailHydra1. I'm out. All right, so here's a few new pieces I got. I got the L.E. Smith Moon and Stars bowl there. It's from the 1920s. I got the, what is that? That's the Carnival Glass bowl. I can't remember who makes that. It's not Imperial. It's somebody else, but it's a really nice bowl. Amberina inside. And I got the vase in the back. Got them all this week. Anyway, guys, I'm out.